May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. So all of us are here as a result of birth pains. Either someone went into labor and hurt and contracted and pushed us out into the world, or someone underwent surgery and was opened up and went through the healing of surgery to bring us out into the world. Our lives are a result of birth pains. And when Jesus in this gospel talks about birth pains, I remember my own labor, of course. So my first labor lasted 20 hours. And I had back labor. All labor is painful, whether it's for an hour or 20 hours. But back labor, I've heard and experienced, is pretty excruciating. And I was not prepared. I was okay for a little while. And then when the contractions started to come one after another so fast, there was not even a chance to catch my breath, I really thought I was going to die. It really felt like there were just knives being pounded into my back. And as much as I had this amazing birth team and a good friend who pushed her strong hands against my back for hours and hours as I labored on my hands and knees, I gave up. I just wanted it to be done. Now, my second labor, I figured, okay, this is going to be so much easier. Second labors always are, right? And I went through pain management classes. I hired a doula who was a certified massage therapist. My husband went through classes to learn how to be a good birth partner. And I was in labor for 40 hours. 32 of them quite painful. I got through probably 25 of those hours in a pretty good state of mind. I breathed, I stayed centered, I kept my eye on my hope. I remembered, okay, a baby is coming out of this. My baby is going to be here, and I will be able to hold her in my arms, and it will all be worth it. And then night turned into day, and day turned into night, and I was still in labor, and there was no baby. And literally, I couldn't breathe. They put me on oxygen, and I, again, just thought, this is the end. This is just the end. I'm not coming out of this. Worst pain I've ever been in. And of course, I got through it, and of course, I have the most amazing lives I could imagine as a result of it. But in the midst of that labor pain, all I could experience was the pain. That was all I could feel as I was in the midst of that 38th and 39th and 40th hour of labor. Now, Jesus compares the suffering that his disciples are going to go through to birth pains. So I want to tell you a little bit. I think it said it was John, but we're actually reading out of Mark this week. So I want to tell you a little bit about the circumstances Mark was writing out of. Mark was likely written during or just after the disastrous Jewish revolt against Roman imperial occupation in Palestine, so 66 to 70 CE. Mark's world was shattered and shaken to its core. The Roman armies vanquished the rebellion and destroyed the Jewish temple, desecrating what for the Jews was nothing less than the sacred heart of the world. The message of Mark's gospel is thus a message of hope proclaimed in the midst of catastrophe, grace in the midst of violence and ruin. To really hear it, we have to listen from the position of desolation, chaos, and bewilderment. We have to listen alongside the traumatized soldier, the displaced refugee, the pregnant teenager, the addict and his heartbroken family, the activist discouraged by a significant setback. This is where the gospel lives. These are the depths from which Mark proclaims God's good news. Mark was not written in a time of hope. Mark was not written in a space of great joy and life that would lead you to immediately think about resurrection and gospel joy. Mark came out of a period where it seemed like the world was ending. I chose the reading from about Hannah out of several options that we had today from our lectionary. And I chose it partly because it's a story about birth, and we have a baptism today, and it fits with birth pangs, but also because of her deep anguish. She is in a different kind of anguish. Her culture saw her, oh, I think my phone is bumping my microphone. Is that what's happening? Okay, we'll move that. She was in a place of anguish because her culture said she only had value if she could produce children, specifically male children. And without a child, and especially a male child, she was redundant at best and cursed by God at worst. She is being bullied in her own home, and every time she goes out into her culture, she takes with her the shame that her culture has heaped on her for not being able to be the kind of woman they believe she needs to be. So she comes into the temple laboring in prayer, laboring in anguish, laboring and contracting and hurting in her spirit so deeply that the priest thinks she is drunk. She is in a place of birth pangs before the birth even comes, spiritual birth pangs. I chose this reading because I wanted us to know if you are in a place of hurting today for whatever reason, if you are in a place where you are struggling with hope, you are not alone. Hannah is with you. The disciples who walked alongside Jesus and could not imagine that his death was leading to resurrection are with you. So many are with you. And I'm of sort of two minds with this reading, this birth pangs reading, because on the one hand, I believe deeply that pain in God's hands can become contractions that lead to real life. Death in God's hands becomes resurrection. That is the hope of the gospel. And on the other hand, I know that sometimes that feels like sugarcoating, to say this is just birth pangs, because there is real pain in the world that just feels meaningless and awful and is not okay. And that is the result of human sin. We use that word, it's a loaded word, so I wanted to say what I mean by it. I mean, when we turn from God, when we turn from life, from love, from resurrection, from hope, and we turn toward destruction, toward broken relationships, toward stripping people of their rights, toward division and violence, that is when that kind of pain happens. And that is real pain, and it is not okay. And it runs in individual hearts, and it runs through institutions and structures, what the Bible calls the powers and principalities. But even that is not the end of the story. The gospel tells us that Jesus came to overcome sin, not just the sin of individual humans, but the sin of whole cultures, of nation that goes against nation, sin that leads to violence and war and destruction and the stripping of human rights and displaced refugees, the sin of addiction that leads to broken hearts, the sin of all that we can imagine, Jesus has come to overcome through his death and resurrection. Now, if you are in a place in the birth process where I was, where it just feels like this is the end, I don't care what happens, there's no hope, that's okay. It was okay that that's where I went because my body had an ancient wisdom to it and it continued to labor. And it continued to do what it needed to do, even though my spirit had given up. Grace is like that. God's grace is like that. God can work through us whether we are in the right mindset or not, whether we have the faith we think we need to have or not, whether we are perfectly hopeful or not. God's grace will continue to work in our world and will continue to bring life out of death. And we as a church, as imperfect as the church is, will continue to come around the table together across our differences, knowing that God's life and resurrection are there at that communion table and are going to enter us and enter our world. We will continue to come together across the promises of resurrection and hope, and we will continue to be a place that works for goodness and justice for all people, regardless of who you are, regardless of whether you are in a place of believing and hope and joy, whoever you are. We are here to work for you and to work for abundant life for you and for our world. I'm going to end with the words from one of my favorite mystics and theologians, Julian of Norwich. She wrote during one of the worst plagues that Europe had ever experienced, and her world was literally dying around her. People were dying of the plague. People were experiencing just hunger and all of the destruction you can imagine. And in the midst of this, she had a vision of the world as a little hazelnut that God held in God's hands. And somehow this little hazelnut, as small and vulnerable as it was sustained because it was made out of the love of God and held in God's hands. And as she prayed for and counseled and wrote to her people who were so scared and so hurting, at the end of this vision, she said, "All will be well. All will be well. All manner of things will be well. In God's grace and love, all will be well. All will be well. All manner of things will be well." Amen.